Hello there. Welcome to Winning in Professional Services. I'm Scott Pressmone, and I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Matteo Travato. So the topic of the day is differentiation in professional services. So whether you are a law firm, an architecture firm, it could be marketing, like marketing agencies and whatnot, anything that's in this fairly commoditized market or a service-based market, I feel it's very important to find a way to differentiate. Would you agree, Matteo?
100%. Yes. I am in one of those commoditized market myself as a marketing consultant. And so I definitely agree with you that having a point of differentiation is crucial, especially in today's day and age with so much competition.
Yeah, and I think one of the common thoughts here when it comes to differentiation is clients that you and I probably work with and ourselves as well. It's easy to think, you know what, my differentiation is my attention to detail, or it's the work ethic of my team, or it's the values my team holds. And while those could be differentiations, the challenge there is that you don't experience them until after you work with a company. And so I think our challenge today is to be thinking about how do we differentiate in a saturated or crowded market where you're trying to get the attention of a new buyer, and that new buyer has to overcome that hurdle of trust prior to having worked with you. So I'm curious, Matteo, is there any company, or it could be a client that you worked with, it could be a brand that you've just been exposed to. Is there anyone that comes to mind where they're maybe in a commoditized or professional services firm that has actually stood out to the point that you know who they are and know who they are because they've been able to do this effectively?
I can't remember exactly the name of this company, but there is a law firm that I came across not long ago that exclusively represents startups in the clean tech space. And so they don't just offer legal services, they've positioned themselves as strategic partners in the sort of fight against climate change. And so they host industry events, publish research of their own, and their partners also sit on boards of sort of environmental organizations and whatnot. So I think that's a great example of maybe taking a stand and focusing on a specific niche or a specific segment of the market.
Mm. That's a great example. I think,
Unfortunately, I can't remember the name of the firm, but yeah.
not to worry. I want to think of a couple even people in the marketing space. There are a
Mhm.
couple people that I think you and I both follow, Donald Miller, Marcus Sheridan. These are individuals that I think have built up a good reputation over the last 3 or so years, and they've got a good following. What's very interesting about both of these two individuals and the companies that they have is they're both marketers, but they come across as almost not anti-marketer marketers, but a lot of their material and a lot of things they do make you trust them as a business owner, but not really think of them as a marketer who's selling you marketing services. So I just think that's an example of someone who our audience might have heard of. Donald Miller, they might have heard of Marcus Sheridan, they might not have, but a lot of people have heard of those people. And if they were just a marketing agency, chances are we wouldn't have heard of those people. And so I think that's what we're trying to think about today is how to stand out like that in a way that's somewhat memorable. Before we really dig into some practical ways to do that, I came across a clip and a quote that I think is worth listening to. The businesses all look alike. This is still largely true today. The reason for this being that most businessmen in this country are playing a game called follow the follower. If a man goes into business, no matter what line it happens to be, the first thing he does is make certain that his place of business, outside and inside, looks exactly like every other place of business of that type in the country. Do you know why? It's because he's playing Copycat, the same game that he was playing when he was just a few years old without even thinking about it. For the same reason kids dress alike in school, he wants to be one of the gang. He doesn't necessarily examine all the business establishments in his field and pattern his on one outstanding example, the one that inspires him, the one that he can really believe in. He just does what everyone else in his business is doing by the simple process that it guarantees his own mediocrity. Whose drum are you marching to, if indeed you're marching to anyone's, and why? So I really liked this quote a lot, Matteo, because I think this game isn't a new game. This idea that professional services firms and other markets have really dealt with this challenge for a long time. And this just rings true for me today. And I'm curious if you have any feelings on this quote from Earl Nightingale from many years ago. What are your thoughts, Matteo?
I think, first of all, it's important to highlight this quote is probably from the 50s, right? Or 40s, around that era. So I would say a few generations ago. And what's interesting, the first time you shared this with me, I think I remember telling you that nothing has really changed in business, like from back then up until today. The business dynamics are pretty much unchanged, right? There's always going to be leaders and there's always going to be followers. To me, that's the first thing to highlight here, is that we can really avoid making a lot of mistakes just by studying the successful companies of the past, or just looking at how companies acted back then and just try not to repeat the same mistakes today. I think history repeats itself. This is a cliche, but it's true also. And the quote itself just says it. It reminds me of, or just makes me think about it's like the Me Too trap in a way, where it's almost like if a competitor adds a service to their offerings or service lineup, so everyone else scrambles to offer the same thing. And so without you really realizing, you are all identical again, right? So like you are following somebody that had an idea about offering some type of service in your industry, and you feel like left behind because you're not doing what they're doing. And then all of a sudden, all of you are doing the same thing. And so you're identical again, like I said. And I think in the quote you said like the kids all wearing the same sort of uniform, right? And it's always the same. Yeah, I would say for me personally, I would really study the companies of the past, or the quotes of the past, and realize that there are ways to escape this uniqueness or sea of uniqueness that we all are surrounded by. And by being unique, you're eventually going to be one of the few that are actually going to stand out. Just by looking at even at your local market, you don't even have to search online. If you just walk around town, you probably see a lot of the same businesses. And I know myself, when I walk around, or even if I go to a mall, I wonder, if I had this business, I would probably do this or that. And I'm pretty sure I probably have more people walking in, or more people stopping by and watching at my window, because I know I could potentially just attract people by adding a few different things or making things just slightly different. And that would, in my mind, already make quite a bit of a difference compared to all the other ones that are offering basically a vanilla product or a vanilla service.
Yeah, I love that you pointed out how everyone ends up copying everyone else and they end up being the same level. So someone stands out over here, then everyone else catches up and now they're the same again. I think it's a really good point. And I also liked in the quote the emphasis on who are you following? Are you actually following the people that are standing out, or are you following the people that are just in your industry? And I think that's a good call to action to think. As you said, you can walk around your town or whatever else to get inspiration, but ideally you're getting inspiration outside of your industry, right? So it could be like, let's say you're a law firm, potentially you could get inspiration from a law firm that's on a different coast or in a different country. But ideally, you're not just trying to become the average of the companies down the street from you. Or even better, I would argue you should get inspiration from companies outside of your industry. If you're buying a product or service and you have to think, why did I buy that product or service? Oh, it's because the owner did X, Y, and Z that made me trust them more. Okay, be thinking about how you can apply that sort of thing to your own business. Differentiation is key to stand out. And I think it's a challenge we all struggle with. And in fact, I think Matteo had already said this, but we struggle with this in our own fields, and really in consultancy, advisory type services. Guess what? There's another professional service commoditized market. And so, yeah, we have to all take this action, even if it's hard. So let's segue into the next topic here, which is what is differentiation and what isn't differentiation? So Matteo, I'm wondering if you can think of maybe when you're talking with clients or other companies that you've worked with, have you ever seen a case where they're focused on the wrong thing? Like they say, oh yeah, we want to differentiate, and they go after something, but it might be really not where the most effort should be put towards. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say by speaking with a lot of business owners, I think, and I'm guilty of this myself as well. If I speak to a business owner, I think a lot of times when they think of differentiation, they think about the look and feel of their company first and foremost. So my website or my letterhead or my logo or whatever. And although that could maybe be part of your differentiation strategy, it's not really what I consider as actually differentiation in the true sense of the word or of the concept itself. So I think, yes, just thinking about the surface level stuff, which is, like I said, the thing that you see is actually less about differentiation. It's more about like that's like the wrapper of the candy. And I think the real differentiation is how the candy tastes. And yeah, that's an analogy, but I think it's true. I think that's what I see. Sometimes entrepreneurs get a little bit too much hang up on this type of things, whereas there's more of a mental exercise sometimes to be done to get to the real core of what's different of your company from the other companies in your same industry.
Yeah, it's a good point. When you're thinking about logos, colors, all this other stuff, I don't want any listeners here that understand branding to think that we're trying to say that branding isn't important. But I like the way you put it as the candy wrapper. I think that while typeface and all this other stuff should be consistent, and you should have a clear brand. Once you have that, what is the benefit of having that? Let's if that you have advertisements or you are multiple places that your brand is showing up, they should remember they should associate those colors or those brand colors and that brand with you. So that is part of the puzzle, is that you need to make sure you're somewhat consistent. And McDonald's in one country is very similar to McDonald's in another country, right? So there's this idea of brand consistency. And so that makes perfect sense to do that. But that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So you can't just say, I know McDonald's is consistent across the globe, and therefore I'm going to be consistent, and that's going to be my differentiation, because you're not a well-known brand yet, in which case, yeah, have that consistency. But then the question becomes, how does someone even know what you are? And I doubt that if you ask a stranger on the street, what do you know XYZ company for? Fill your own company in there. I doubt they're going to say, I think of sans serif and I think of light blue color, right? That's really not what differentiation is, and even what really branding is. And so going into what you already started to talk about there, Matteo, what is branding? I think and I'm saying branding, but now I'm mixing these two a little bit, but branding and differentiation in your brand, I think it's way more about how it's less so what you feel and more so the way it's received. So it's how do your customers, or how do people that see your brand, maybe that haven't done business with you yet, how do they perceive you? And do they even know that you exist? And if you're not differentiating enough, then they don't know you exist. And what makes people love you? What makes people recognize you? What makes people perceive you well? And then how do you stand out from a very crowded market, which I know is obviously easier said than done. But any other thoughts on that, Matteo?
I'm curious to know from you what, like you said, why do people love you? Would you agree also that somehow differentiation is about trying to leave some people behind in a way? You're trying to take a stand about what you are and why people should love you, but also if some people love you, will eventually some people not love you?
Oh, I love that. I love that point, Matteo. I couldn't agree with you more. I think the things that will make some people love you are the things that will make other people hate you. And so I know we don't want to live in a polarized world. So potentially you don't take things of getting into politics or religion or something like that. Maybe you don't want to do that as part of your company brand. But I guarantee anything that you do that will cause some people to love you will cause others to not like you. And
Mhm.
in a land of trolls and other things that we get online, you're always going to have people. I'm going to steal a term that you've also said in the past, Matteo, is that we don't want to become vanilla. And if you're trying to be loved by everyone, the reality is you're going to have the opposite effect. You're either going to become forgotten, or you're just going to be so boring they're not even going to be thinking about you, and you're going to become vanilla. And I think the topic of this conversation today is really about how to not be vanilla.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah. To me, like when I think of differentiation, I think also about what is our only we factor, quote unquote, only we. So like, what is it something that we only do and that nobody else does? I know it's easier said than done, right? Especially if you offer marketing service, what is it something that we do and that someone else does? And that's really something that the leadership of the company has to sit down and really think through, probably multiple sessions even, and just try to figure that out. Because once you have that, I think it's gonna become much easier to paint that picture of yourself as someone that is fairly unique, despite offering a fairly commoditized service. But there are definitely elements of your company that should be unique to you. And so that's one thing I think should be done by every company, considering that's trying to stand out in a market that is fairly crowded. And then I also imagine that even if you are not in a crowded market just yet, I'd be almost ready to bet that at some point that market will get commoditized at some point. And so I see differentiation really as a form of future proofing your company for that time of your industry where more and more competitors are going to enter, and maybe the barrier to entry into your industry are going to be so low that you're going to be flooded by new competitors. But if you have had that sort of longer term vision of differentiating yourself, it's going to be much easier to not even see those new entrants as competitors at all, because you're going to have had that opportunity to carve a unique position in the marketplace that nobody is going to ever able to overtake.
yeah, it's a great point. One thing I would push back a little bit on, I totally agree with you about the kind of first mover advantage, but going to your point about if a lot of companies, one company is offering something that others aren't, then they of course have a bunch of copycats. So people are going to follow them. And so I don't think you're necessarily future proofing yourself. And I know you didn't say this, but I don't think you're future proofing yourself by doing some of these things. But
Mm-hmm.
what you are doing is you're flexing the muscle of continually standing out and ahead of the rest. And so while everyone else will follow you, the point is you can't settle, right? Because as soon as you settle, they are going to catch up. And so you're really just working that muscle of differentiation and continuing to be at the forefront and not worrying about the other people that are going to follow you because you're constantly innovating. But if you're settling, that's tough. That's really tough. Now, I want to also double down on a point of like, why now? Why do we need to do this stuff now? Or do we have to do this stuff now? Because I can imagine listeners right now, you may be thinking, okay, fine, you're talking a lot of fluffy stuff. You're talking about the things I need to be doing, easier said than done, right? And so it's easy to go back into the regression to the mean, go back to the way you've always done things. And I'll quickly share my belief, and I want to get your take on this too, Matteo. But my feeling is that now is a very difficult time for small business owners and professional or small and mid-sized business owners in the professional services space. It's especially difficult. And I'm not going to get into the economics of it and whatnot, but the idea is that you have a lot of acquisitions going on now because you have large companies have advantages today. And it's very easy for them to either acquire smaller businesses or just take over certain marketplaces. And so if you are a commoditized, pretty standard XYZ company in the professional services space, the idea of just getting by, I think it's kill or be killed. I think out there you really have to take an action. And bigger business has the advantage. And the question is, what are you going to do if you're a smaller mid-sized business to stand out so that you're not just essentially you're not the first one. I think there's a saying about you don't have to be the fastest animal in the pack as long as you're not the slowest, because you don't want to get nipped off by the crocodile or the cheetah or whatever it is. And so the question is, how can you get as far in front of the pack as possible so that you actually can continue to survive? Because you certainly don't want to be the back of the pack. And one example I want to share here is if anyone's heard of the company MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy is of course a large company that's been around for years and years, led by Michael Saylor. But Michael Saylor, more recently, he's taken a turn with his company and he's done some things to differentiate himself as a smaller company because he saw, oh, wow, it's actually a lot harder to get 20% profit year over year. And it's more difficult to attract good talent. It's more difficult to do all these things. So as a smaller business going against companies like Microsoft or Salesforce or whatever else, there's no way that I can really compete to them. So I have to do something very different. And so in his case, and I'm not going to go deep into this, but in his case, he went after utilizing Bitcoin in this space to hold his treasury in Bitcoin. Now, that might seem crazy to anyone who thinks that's a scary thing or whatever, but my point to that is not to focus on Bitcoin. It's to focus a little bit more on him taking a risk to not just be a standard company. And essentially, if you Google Michael Saylor, I guarantee you, he has far more attention, far more visibility, far more differentiation than other companies in his space by far, because he did something risky and out there and based on his beliefs, as opposed to just being one of the crowd. And so my thought is just that it's either take an action or and have a chance of succeeding and growing, or die a slow death, or essentially have this kind of steady or maybe slow decline, maybe slow incline. But I'm curious if you've seen that with the companies that you've talked to and worked with, Matteo. Are a lot of companies out there struggling today because since they haven't differentiated, they're just having this slow, steady, not really huge growth, or maybe a slow, steady decline? Have you seen that at all?
Oh, I do. I do see it on a daily basis, and I think it's easy, I would say, for us to talk about it in a setting like this. But I also understand it's hard sometimes for a moving train to maybe change direction. And I know that the change of direction doesn't have to be sudden; it could be gradual. But at times, it's hard when the organization is already headed towards a certain track, and then maybe as a consultant, as an external consultant, or even if the internal marketing team or strategic team is thinking about what positioning or which stance we should take. Sometimes those conversations can take months and months to actually then be implemented into actual changes for the company. Yeah, I do see this. I think the biggest sort of fear companies have is that, am I going to leave potential revenue on the table if I take a stance, if I position myself to be a certain type of company and try not to be liked by everyone? I think that's the biggest fear I hear most people, most companies have when it comes to talking about differentiating themselves. That's what I see. It's easy to imagine yourself as a generalist or someone who'd want to work with everyone at any given time, everybody who knocks at your door with the money in their hands and willing to pay for the services you offer. But with that, you're also, in my mind, diluting your unique positioning as a company. And you might think, oh, but nobody's knowing if I work with this or that company. But reality is that even your service delivery teams are not going to be as competent working with every type of business or client coming through the door if you're just accepting to work with everyone. So even internally, you want to have some type of specialization so that you can serve your clients better, you can make your existing clients happier, you can have a sort of a more positive type of referral loop that happens because of the good work that you're doing within a very specific segment of the market, for example. And yeah, ultimately, when I think about positioning, it's either thinking about or either taking a blue ocean approach where you identify, instead of competing in a crowded market, you try to find an uncontested market and try to position yourself in that type of market. Or really, it's about niching down as much as possible.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I do also want to give another out because I have spoken with companies where we start talking about differentiation and things. And when we actually start talking about the goals and the objectives, I find out that the goals and the objectives are basically just to get a paycheck at the end of the day. It's like some owners, for instance, really just say, look, I've already reached this height and I really just want to coast from here and just make sure I retire whatever with a bit of money. And in that case, if they don't have a lot of energy left to essentially take anything on and go on offense, then actually that slow decline might make sense, right? So the question becomes, what is your goal? What is your objective, right? And if it's to be acquired, that's one different objective. If it's to pass this off to someone else in your company and keep the company living, that's another objective. If it's to grow and take things on, then that's another objective. But you have to be thinking about those things. But I'm just saying, if you want growth and you don't want slow decline, you don't have many choices left. If you want growth, you have to take some action that's going to be uncomfortable. And we all know, and we've said it many times, it's easier said than done. But that I do believe is the case. Now, in terms of specifics, so you had mentioned, Matteo, the idea of niching down, and we know that this isn't new advice, but at the same time, if you're going against larger companies, then the idea of competing with them on breadth of services is probably not going to fare well. So there are companies out there that can do everything, and they have this great ecosystem. Actually, you know what? A company that comes to mind, not in professional services, but it's Apple, right? Apple created this thing where they have the software, they have the iTunes, they have all these different hardwares, they have phones, they have laptops, they have all these different things. And I think it's easy to look at those companies and say, they do all these things. But if we're now saying, hold on, are we in Apple? Do we have Apple's budget? I think you have to say, if it's David and Goliath and we're David, we have to play the game of David. We can't play the game of Goliath. And so, in my opinion, and I know I'm merging the two professional services in a smaller mid-sized business together, but in this case, if we're a smaller, somewhat commoditized business, the question becomes, how do we stand out in a market and win? And as much as it's been said for years and years, niche down, I just think that the order of operations are niche down, get very good at something, get very well known for something, and really dominate that market, right? In whatever way you can. Maybe it's just in your local area. And then you can go about adding additional things on top of that. But do you agree with that strategy, Matteo?
I do. To me, yeah, I totally agree. I think start with a very narrow offering and then expand over time is definitely better. I'd imagine a lot of the small business, personally, a lot of the small professional service companies I work with don't have the ability to, even though they may communicate to their clients that they offer a whole variety of services. I think ultimately, if they really think about those services deeply, they are really experts in probably a handful of them or even fewer. And so it would probably be better to just start really niching down and doubling down on those services that you feel you're the strongest. And then, if it makes sense, if you feel like you have an actual strategic advantage to expand your service offering, then it makes sense to potentially offer more than what you have started with. I think another way to think about differentiation, I think I mentioned this about this strategy before, but it's thinking about what is the hard stuff that other companies don't want to do and do that. I know of a consulting firm, I came across a consulting firm that specializes in post-merger integration for tech companies. And what they noticed is that most firms rush through the cultural integration piece. And so they developed a year-long program specifically for aligning company cultures. It's a long, sometimes messy process that a lot of firms tend to avoid. But there are clients that find this type of service extremely valuable. And this type of company just does that. And this is a very long and, like I said, hard process to go through. So really trying to find what is the one thing that other companies tend to avoid doing and do that. And one good way to find that out is if you already have a portfolio of clients, it's just talking to your existing clients and figure out what are those problems, big problems that they haven't been able to solve yet, that they would pay big money for someone to come in and solve for them. Now, it potentially doesn't mean that you have to go in and do that and change your service offering altogether just to accommodate their needs, but that could potentially be a way to identify problems that you may not have thought about solving earlier.
I love that, Matteo. I love that you focused on you have to find your edge. So essentially, what are you and your team well positioned to do? That's one thing, right? And if you, like I've worked with companies that service company clients outside of their region. So for instance, if you're in a low cost of labor region, maybe your edge is that you have low cost of labor, right? But your edge is not the time zone that you work in. And so you have to think, what is the edge that you have? And you really have to double down on that edge. But if you were to copy other companies in your space or some competitors that have a different edge than you, then chances are you're going to fail at that game. You're going to lose that game. I also love that you pointed out that doing things that other people don't want to do. I'll briefly speak about myself, and I'm in the space of fractional, so fractional CMO. and I work with companies to come in and build out their internal teams. And something that I found very interesting about that is that I wouldn't say is a differentiation. Like 1 million people can put fractional XYZ on their LinkedIn profile. But one thing that I found really interesting was that when I've met with other people in this space that I'm in, I talk to them about things like how do they deal with hiring? How do they deal with firing people? How do they deal with getting buy-in of things? How do they deal with going into the office and doing some of these other things with companies? And I've heard from a lot of people in my space that they don't do these things. They say, oh, no, I don't do the hiring. That's up to my client to do. And I don't do the firing. That's up to, and there's all these things that they don't do because those are the hard things. They say, no, I work on the decks. I work on the presentations. I pitch the branding thing or whatever. And it's okay. So you're not doing the hard things. Right. And that is a case where it allows me to differentiate, because if any of my clients are talking about what they think a fractional XYZ or fractional CMO in my case is, they might get a different definition from someone else who's trying to compete against me because they're not doing those hard things. So I love your point of, I think it's a little bit of a pipe dream to think I want to do the easy work and I want to do the stuff that I like to do, the sexy stuff or whatever else, and I want to then kill it in that market. I think that your edge could be that you're willing to do some of the trash collection, or you're doing some of the plumbing work in today's age, right? A lot of people don't maybe want to be plumbers or garbage collectors. Guess what? You can make a lot of money doing those things because no one wants to do them. And in this case, it's a matter of doing some of the things other people don't want to do, but stuff that you're willing to do or things that you can get better and better at, because something might be very difficult and challenging, but the more you do it, the less challenging it'll be. And the beauty of that is what you said before about being ahead of the curve here, Matteo, is that thing is very hard to do. Oh man, I don't want to touch that industry. That's such a difficult industry. That's a barrier to entry. That's what we call an advantage. That's the edge, right? And so if that is an industry that's a huge pain, and oh my, I'm going to use an example of, I've heard, I'm not calling out a specific company, but I'm just saying there might be that law firms are really difficult to deal with, or doctors are very difficult to deal with, right? And you can say, I don't want to work with law firms. I don't want to work with doctors because they're very difficult to deal with. But guess what? If you know how to work with clients that are very limited in their time or whatever else, and you're able to then learn how to build rapport with that area, learn exactly what they need, exactly how they need it, and tailor your service to them, well, guess what? You're going to have no one really trying to compete against you, because they're going to try at a surface level to compete against you in that industry that you're targeting. But they're not going to put in the full effort to actually be able to overcome that hurdle, because they're looking for the easy clients to work with. And so I think it's so important to be thinking long-term, doing the tough things in the here and the now. And before you know it, it's all your team will know how to do. They know exactly how to do with those difficult clients, because that's what they've been doing for the last 3 or 5 years. And so that's your moat, right? So what are your thoughts on that, Matteo? You were the one that brought this up in terms of doing the difficult things, but let me rephrase this question. Have you ever worked where people were avoiding the difficult clients or the difficult industry, and they weren't necessarily, maybe they were trying to acquire those clients on a surface level basis? So they'll say, I'll create a page on my website to target this, or I'll create an email campaign to target this. But they're not necessarily realizing that in order to actually accomplish that, they have to put in a lot more time and a lot more investment. Has that happened in your experience?
Yeah, it has happened. And I think I have a few thoughts about this. First of all, I would say it's easy for any type of professional service to do this, but it's particularly easy for the kind of professional services that are more, I would say, location independent or location agnostic, which means they're basically just acquiring their clients online, right? For the most part. So you would imagine that, oh, I can acquire any client I want, basically. I don't have physical boundary, like geographical boundaries that are limiting me to reaching this or that vertical. Now, I think as marketers, sometimes we over rely on the ability of online marketing itself to create business opportunities for the company. Because yes, one thing is I create a new service or industry page and hoping that people will find that page, or even that page is going to rank on Google for whatever term I'm optimizing it for. But then do you actually have the case studies, the actual industry knowledge to serve that type of client? Imagine a client that you had imagined, yeah, that's maybe a profitable type of client I want to work with, but you don't have any experience servicing that type of client. How would you feel about if that client would actually knock at your door today and asking you for whatever service you're offering? So yeah, it's I think it's more common than not to sometimes come across companies that have this kind of shiny object syndrome, or even just thinking, oh, if we're talking about online marketing, I know that maybe a certain key phrase or search term has a high volume. And so that means that, oh, I could potentially grab a slice of that cake or of that market by creating a page, like you said before. I would say really just think about, do you have a strategic advantage going into a new market? Why do you want to go in that market? Do you have an insider type of knowledge? Do you have prior experience working with certain types of companies or industries? Or is there anyone in your team that has that knowledge that can contribute to the strategic differentiation of your offering to maybe other companies that are already in that space? Because I would be pretty sure that there are other companies doing what you are thinking of doing, and they have been doing it for longer than you. So you're just going in as a fresh new company, trying to grab the type of clientele without having done a lot of the groundwork that those other companies have done maybe for longer than you. Yeah. To answer the question, yes, I do see this happening. And usually my recommendation would be to always think through about the actual reason why you want to get into that type of market. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that we were talking before about the David and Goliath, and it's interesting because if you say we're location independent, we can service clients anywhere, that is great. That could be an advantage. And then you're saying, oh, we can try to acquire this type of client over here in this other region. Okay, fair enough. But you have to remember, does someone else have a bigger budget and more dollars behind that same idea that's in yet another region, right? So try not to think just of your perspective of it would be great to hit that client base that's right for the taking. Let me go after that, and start to think, as you said, what's your edge? What's your edge? What is it that you can provide to them that the Goliath over there that also is grabbing this location independent market and they're targeting this region, this whatever, what is it that you have that they don't have? And if you think that your only edge is that you're going to target them and you just want to get more clients, that's not an edge. That's not an edge. And so get deeper. Now, I want to share a specific example again. Let's say that we are a company that's trying to target a specific industry, right? And we don't want to affect our current business, right? Because there's this idea of, look, if I start to service one industry, let's say I'm a law firm and I offer a whole bunch of different types of services, I don't want to now say on my homepage and everywhere in my material that I just focus on this one specific type of service, right? Because I want people to come in and be able to know that I do other stuff. Okay, that's fair enough. But I think there are ways to do this to where you're able to double down in an area without necessarily sacrificing your current business. Okay. And I'll give one example. There is a company, not that I worked with directly, but that one of my colleagues has. They're in the IT MSP space, and they have a successful operation and everything like this. But then they realized that they were working with registered investment advisors, I believe, RIAs, and they were doing a lot of work in that space. And so rather than just going onto their website and saying, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create a new industry page. I'm going to do a find and replace to where I replace it all with, we help RIAs. We help RIAs. We are the best at servicing RIAs, right? And maybe putting some RIA testimonials on there, right? I just don't think that cuts it. I think that's a starting point, but I don't think that cuts it. So in this case, this particular company spun off a different brand to target RIAs. And I guess I will say it because it's a positive story, but it's called RIA Workspace. And if you go to RIA Workspace, what you'll see is they're offering IT services, but guess what? They're tailored to RIAs. And I think the reason I'm pointing this out is because they didn't have to change their core business to do this, but I will say that they had to invest a lot of time and effort into developing a second brand in this case and a second website and things like that around that target. And that's what I'm saying when I say you can't dabble. You have to believe, right? In this case, I believe the owner really knew how to work with RIAs, really knew how to deliver a quality service to RIAs, in which case he had an edge in that space. But he didn't just say, I'm better. He put his money where his mouth is and began investing time and effort into going after that versus dabbling. Because I think one of the most dangerous things to do is to dabble. Hey, maybe we could work with that industry. Hey, maybe we could work with that. Hey, maybe we should focus on this. And then have a 3-month to 1 year initiative and say, oh, that didn't pan out, and then close it down, and then say, maybe we could work with the next industry. And so I think this is the thing that I see time and time again is this Dabbling, oh, it didn't work out, but it's either an underinvestment in money or underinvestment in time or both. And then saying, oh, that didn't work. And I just think so many companies are doing that today. It's hard to invest a lot of money in things, but that's where I go back to what you said at the beginning. If you know your edge and you know what you believe in, then you're going to have enough conviction to do something, do the hard things, stick with it, do it longer than you want to do it. And guess what? Your differentiation is the fact that you're the one of the few companies that actually stuck with it long enough to get an effect. Whereas so many others quit before they see any success.
Yeah, I agree. I think treating everything as an experiment will end up leading to probably a lot of dissatisfaction, and you're not going to see the results that you are expecting to see. Like you say, if you just dabble into trying something and see if it pays off for whatever reason, so that you can then invest more money into it. Like you said, if you're not really committed to getting into a certain, say, industry, then just not do it. And also, I think what I've seen is that oftentimes the companies that jump from industry to industry or just don't have that particular differentiation are probably the ones that are treating the market or looking at the market as scarce of opportunities, whereas like the market is full of opportunities, really, in any industry. Like you can take the smallest segment of the market, and even in that market, if you have revenue goals, which every company should have, you just basically have to do some reverse math to figure out how many companies in that segment of the market you have to work with to achieve your revenue goals. Like obviously, if you want to have $100 billion professional service company, yeah, okay, maybe just one industry may not be enough, depending on what industry. There could be industries that are just as big, but ultimately, I think as a professional service business, your services are fairly high priced in most cases, which means you don't need thousands of clients to achieve your revenue goals. And so really having that narrow focus is helpful, not just because you're now specialized in that industry, but really you're removing a lot of distractions also. You're just focused on that one industry. You go to those type of industry events, you get your name out to every potential industry prospect that there is. And over time, I think there's really no reason why you shouldn't achieve the results and goals that you set yourself to achieve.
That's a great point. And when you mention going to events, I just think that's another case where we could share the difference between dabbling and going big into it. So in a case of dabbling would be saying, I want to target some industry. I know we'll go to that conference and we'll have some business cards and we'll send our sales development manager out there, or sorry, business development manager out there. And then, oh man, that conference didn't pay off. We didn't get the money for it. Lost that one. That's a case of, I think, believing that short thing is going to have an impact. Whereas I'd say going into it means saying, okay, we're going to your point, work backwards from what a client is worth to us and starting to say, okay, if we can acquire 2 clients this year in this new industry that we're targeting, then, how much are we willing to commit to this initiative? Maybe that is a $300,000 commitment. And I know it depends on the size of the company, but I'm just saying that I think people often underestimate the cost of tapping into a new market or having substantial change of success than what they had in the past. They may need to invest substantially more than they thought they would. But again, if you're basing that off math of what is a client worth, and you say, what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit to going really hard into this industry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have one of my people really focused on this initiative at a minimum, at least one person 100% focused on this initiative. I'm going to make sure that we're going to events. I'm going to make sure that we're presenting at events. I'm going to make sure that we are known in the space and highly engaged in the LinkedIn communities and whatnot around those things. I'm going to run email campaigns about all this other stuff. I'm going to run a podcast. Essentially, I'm saying a lot of stuff, and maybe that's too much to take on if you're just getting into this for the first time. But my point to this is that far too many people think that I'm going to set up an ads campaign, and then I'm going to get an advertisement in some magazine, and then I'm going to have my business development rep go out next Thursday to this one event. And they think that is an initiative. And I'm just here to say, in a professional services space, that is not an initiative. That will not cut it. So now I think we're reaching a little bit of the close here, Matteo, but back to the point of the actions that we can take, because these things are easier said than done. Okay. But what are the tangible, like the things that we can do to start moving in this direction? And I have a couple ones, and I want to see if there's any more that you have to add to this. But I would say, to summarize what we've talked about, you need to determine first where you have an edge. That could be just in the skill set of the owners, that could be the team that you have, whatever. But essentially, where do you have an edge over your competitors? You need to determine where you want to go and what you're most interested in. So that it plays into the point of perseverance. What do you really believe in, right? What do you believe you can have an impact in? You need to set a budget for what it's going to take to run an initiative like this, and set a timeline, because of course you don't want to be throwing money at something that's you're lighting money on fire, right? So you might want to say, I'm going to run this initiative for a year and a half, 2 years, right? I'm not sure what that length is, but hopefully it's not 3 months, because that's probably not going to be it. But you have to set something like this. And then you need to, I'd argue, most of these initiatives are going to involve you have to get your face out there. So whether it's the business development, or it's going to events, or it's starting a podcast, or it's running videos, whatever it is, it's getting your face out there. And I'm summarizing issues that you laid out here, or ideas that you laid out there, Matteo, as well. But you have to stand for things that you believe in and have conviction in. So this might mean that if you're targeting a specific industry, or if you're targeting a type of person that cares about a specific thing, then you might be alienating yourself to others, and you need to know that in order to not be vanilla, you're going to be disliked, and you need to have the conviction to stick to it. So is there anything you think that I missed summarizing our conversation, Matteo?
No, I think you've covered all of the most important points. To me, really, I would double down on the fact that differentiation is not a one-time event. Yes, it may not need to be something that, if we don't see any results after a while, then of course we may need to revisit the strategy. But just going in with a longer term mindset is crucial. It's not about, like you said, doubling. It's more about committing and getting into this thing for the long term. Just imagine yourself. It's almost like when somebody gets into starting to market their company, I always ask them, like, how long do you see yourself being part of this company, or owning this company, or running this company? Because that's just as much you need to continue doing marketing for your company. You can't just do it today and not do it tomorrow. You have to continue doing it. And the same is for differentiation. It's, you take a stance, you go down that path, you find some success, and maybe you branch out to maybe a secondary industry later on. But just go down the path with the conviction that you're going to succeed also.
Yeah, and I'll close this on one final point that reminded me of, Matteo. It's that diversification can be the enemy here, in my opinion, because we hear, of course, in investments and things, you want to be diversified. You don't want to be stock picking and just saying, I know I'm going to put all my money on that. You don't want to bet the whole farm. You don't want to bet on black and just go down with the ship. I think it's important to not be super risky with all of this. But at the same time, if you say, I'm going to run 5 initiatives and dabble a little bit of money in 5 different areas, that to me is vanilla again. That to me is not holding a conviction and a belief in anything. Now, potentially you can have more than one initiative running, in which case, if you say, look, we take the company in this direction, or maybe 3, I don't know. But in that case, make sure you have money to invest in 3 things at the same time. Make sure you have resources to invest in 3 things, but don't try to take one resource and spread them across 3 things. Instead, realize that running 2 initiatives is maybe diversifying enough. You're putting a good amount of money into this and a good amount of money into that because you believe in those 2 things. You truly believe in those 2 things, in which case maybe one of those will hit. But do not spread it so thin that you're just trying to say, oh, we'll take a little bit of our profits and put a little bit and dabble into this and a little bit and dabble into that, because chances are none of them are going to then end up winning. And then I think the problem with that is just that you don't have conviction. And I see that happen far too often. So that's my call to action here. I think at the end of this podcast, it's find your edge, find what you're willing to commit to. Matteo, to your point, figure out how long, what your timeline is for doing that, and set it up and remind yourself of that. So when you're setting that goal of, I'm going to tap into this market, set that goal, set that timeline, and make sure that 3 weeks down the road, you're not changing to the next shiny object. And instead you're saying, no, I committed to this year, focusing on this industry or this medium or this whatever it may be, and commit to that, have it written on paper and on a sticky note, just so you know because honestly, the enemy here is not dedicating enough time and effort and not sticking with things for long enough. So with that, I think we're going to close this episode. Thank you so much, Matteo, for joining me today. And thank you to all the listeners. Please do give us feedback if there's a topic you'd like us to cover. If you feel that you have other feedback, Scott talks too much, I want to hear more from Matteo, anything like that, leave that feedback for us and we'll take that to heart. So thank you so much. And until next time.